Okay, um, so we just kind of covered the kilo converter, and we showed the J-frame, and inside the J-frame we have a panel. Inside the panel we have a text, we have a label, and we have a button. Well, at this point, nothing got executed because there's no code for the button. So what we need to do now is we need to add some code so that it does something when we basically execute it. So let me grab the next guy, which I believe is the kilo converter, but it's the phase 2. So take a look at it. We got the same variables. I'm creating a J panel, I'm creating a label, I'm creating a text field. And I'm using the J panel, the J label, the J text field, and the J button. Those are all objects that have a whole lot of stuff that they can do. I've got my two constants for the window height and width. Here's my constructor, kilo converter 2. It sets the title, it sets the width and the height. It says, what do you do if you click on the upper X? We want you to go ahead and close this. We build the panel, and then we add the panel, and then we set visibility equals true. So now we come down here, we've got to build the panel. And we've got our message label. It's a new J label, so we instantiate it. We've got our new J text field set to 10. We've got our new J button. We set that to calculate, so it displays calculate on the button. Now I've got this new thing called calcButton.add action listener, and it's basically going to be set as a new, what's that? Right here. So so it says add action listener, and it's a new calc button listener. So what the heck is that guy doing? Well, think of a listener as a program that we basically put it on our object, and it's just sitting there listening. It's waiting for something to happen. And if we click on that object, in this case it's a button, that listener goes, oh, you just clicked on something, we need to do something, and it will basically do what needs to happen. And in this case, we come down here, we have a class. Now look at this. We've now got a class inside of a class. Wow, that's kind of wild. So I've got this class called calcButtonListener, and it implements the action listener. So implement, that means it's a an interface, and so it grabs all those things. We've got action performed, and that's where we've got our conversion, which is a constant. We've got our string input, we've got our double miles. I come down here and I say input kilo text field dot get text. So that's where it grabs this text box called kilo text field. Whatever we type in there, it grabs it and throws it into input. And then we say miles equals double dot parse double. So we have to convert that input from a string to a double. And we put that into miles, and then we multiply it by conversion, which is this 0.6214. Then I use a J option pane to display kilometers is basically that miles and miles. Okay, so miles right here is our converted field. At the bottom we've got our public static void main, so we can actually, instead of having a separate method to basically execute this, we can actually have that method built right in at the bottom. Okay, so the only difference between this one and the previous is this calc button listener. So right here I've got a add a listener, so that when we, so if you're familiar with Visual Basic, Visual Basic has these they're called events. So when I click on something, or if I hover over something, or if I do a right click on something, or I have a mouse up function, a mouse down event. So all these different events that happen, Visual Basic captures, and C++ has those, C#, all those have those same events. Well, we don't have events, we have listeners in Java. So again, if I run this guy, I'm going to see the same exact box appear. Enter the distance of kilometers. So I type in 100 and I click calculate, and it comes up 100 kilometers is 62.139999999 miles. And again, we could use the decimal format to basically format it a little better. But again, now we're able to actually do things by clicking on the button. We've got a button listener. Now, the button listener says, hey, when you click on me, I'm going to go ahead and execute whatever you want me to execute. So another thing we can modify, this is more for formatting, we can change our background and foreground colors of different things of the window. And I can use what is called a color object. So I can set the color to black, cyan, gray, light gray, orange, red, yellow, basically all the different colors that are basically available to us. 778. And so then I could say J option, OK button dot new button, and I could say OK button dot set background. So I do have a set background, I have a set foreground. So if I got background, what is foreground? That's actually the font color. The background is going to be the background color, font. The font color is the foreground color. So those methods are available to us on our window, on our buttons, and everything else. So I've got this thing called color window. Double click on color window, and here I've got my set default operation on close. I got my message label, set, click a button to select a color, and then I've got 3 buttons. I've got a red button is a new J button red, blue button is a new J button blue, and yellow is a new J button yellow. So I'm creating 3 button objects. So then I say red button dot add action listener, new red button listener, add action listener, new blue button listener. So I've actually created 3 listeners for each one of those objects. Then I come down here and I create a new panel. On the panel I add the message label and I add those 3 buttons. Then I say add panel, which adds it to the actual window I'm currently in. Then I go ahead and set visible true so now it displays on the screen. So if I click on the red button, that's basically what this red button listener will execute. It says panel dot set background. So now we've got the panel, which is the actual window panel. We set that to red. We set the foreground color to blue. If we click on the blue button, it sets the background color to blue, sets the foreground color to yellow. If I click on the yellow button, it sets the background color to yellow and sets the foreground color to black. And here's my public static void main, which basically goes ahead and creates a new color window, which basically starts the whole thing working. So here's my window that comes up. When I click on red, background color is red, foreground color is blue. Click on blue, background color is blue, foreground color is yellow. I click on yellow, background color is yellow, foreground color is black. And I can basically click on each one of those. Now realize if I keep clicking red, it is executing that code. So it is changing the background color to red and the foreground color equal to blue. So pretty cool stuff there. So again, we got some formatting that we can do. Could we change the background color of a button? We sure could. We could actually, I'll try it right now. I will say, let's see, do I first have access to it? I'll say red button. So here I am, my red button. I'm going to change the blue button. So I'm going to say blue button dot set. Set background color to yellow. We'll say color dot yellow. So now when I execute this, and I click on the red button, see what it did? It changed the blue color button background color to yellow. Okay. We didn't have what's called an action event object. The action listener's action perform method has a parameter variable named E that we declare as follows. Action event E. Remember we talked about the when we do a try catch, and we can basically grab the E, which is the error. Action event is a class that is defined in the Java API. When an action event occurs, like clicking the listener, okay? The object of the action event class is created. The action listener's action perform method is called, and a reference to the action event object is passed to the E parameter. So when the action performed method executes, the E parameter references the event object that was generated in the response to the event. Okay? So down here on table 12.4, I've got get the action command that returns the action command for that event, and get source returns a reference to the object that is generated in this event. So we've got the get action command method. So here we've got the event object window. So let's take a look at the event object window. So there I've got my buttons. I've got button 1, 2, and 3. I've got my J panel, and I've got my window width. Now in the previous one, we had 3 separate methods. One for the red, one for the blue, one for the yellow. Well, we normally wouldn't do that. We would have one method that we would use, and that's kind of what the get action, that's basically what's going on there. So here I've got button 1, button 2, button 3, create 3 separate buttons, and then I've got button 1 add action listener, new button listener. Button 2 add action listener, new button listener. So you notice they're all calling the same button listener. I got I create a new panel, and then I add button 1, 2, and 3 to my panel. Then I add the panel to the window, and I set visible true. So now you notice all I've got is this button listener. It's a class, and then inside there I've got my action performed. And look what's basically being brought in automatically is the action event E. Whenever we basically click and execute the action listener, the action event object is automatically created, and it basically captures whatever was basically just processed. So it was a click of the button, whatever the case may be. So then I can say string action command equals E.get action command. We can find out what they did. What did they click on? It says if the action command equals button 1. Notice the name of the button up here is button 1. So if it's button 1 that basically got clicked, then we know to say you just clicked button 1. So we can put all the code for button 1 in this if statement. Else if the action command equals button 2, we can do all of the stuff for button 2 in this if statement. And else if button 3, we can do it all right here, and away we go. Now, would I want to just have an else if? Wouldn't I want that last one to be an else? Probably not, because what if I had another button and basically I clicked on that guy? Well, it would basically fall through and do that. So this is kind of one of those situations where we want to make sure we have it coded just for the button that we want. Again, very last thing is I got my public static void main, and I basically just created a new event object, which basically creates this class, which then kicks off that constructor, which kicks off the whole process, and away we go. So if I run it, there I've got button 1, 2, and 3. Click on button 1, just click on the first button, Button 2, you just click on the second button. Button 3, you just click on the third button. So not too bad. I mean, pretty straightforward. Again, this saves us a lot of duplicate code. We can have one method to handle all of our events, all of our listeners. Okay, on page 787, we have this thing called Layout Manager. So Layout Manager is an object that governs the position and sizes of the components in the container. Right now, we're just throwing message boxes and labels and buttons on there, and they're just getting placed wherever they basically default to. Well, with Layout Managers, we can kind of start telling it where we want things to happen. So we've got first one called the Flow Layout Manager. That one arranges components in a row. This is the default layout manager for J-Option panes. This is the Flow Layout Manager, and that's kind of what we've seen so far, is that's what it defaulted to. So, to see what a flow layout looks like, here I've got my flow window extends the J-frame. I've got my width and height. Here's my constructor. Set my titles, set my size, set my default close operation, and now I say set layout, which is a new flow layout. So this guy then says, okay, what type of layout is this window going to have? I create my 3 buttons, I add those buttons, and then I set visible equals true, and then I say new flow window and executes. So if I execute this guy, there it basically goes button 1, 2, and 3. Now notice it puts button 3 down below. Why? Because our window isn't wide enough to display all 3 buttons side by side. If I were to go back up here and let's say I'll change the width to, I'll say 350, and then re-execute, we'll see that all 3 buttons then are in a row. Okay. It does center the buttons on the screen. That's why you have 1, 2, and then 3's down below centered.
Does it automatically do that? Is the button size automatically?
Right, the button size is automatic. Again, the button has parameters. We can set the size and width of a button as well. We'll see here in a second, though, where it will basically take the size of wherever it's going. Adjusting the float layout component gaps. I can do flow layout and int alignment, int horizon gap, and int vertical gap. I can put those in there and notice basically what it will do. It will change our alignments. It will change our gapping.
791, is that what that says?
Yep. Then we have what's called the border layout. And the border layout is kind of a strange beast. And it's got a north region and a south region. So think of a north region as your header, the south region as your footer. Then I've got a west region, a center region, and a east region. So in between the header and footer, we've got 3 sections. And so if I look at the border window, there I've got a window width of 400, 300. Again, we've got a class border width that extends the J-frame. So it has everything a J-frame has. Here's my constructor. It automatically gets executed. It's a no-word constructor. We set the title, set the size, set the default close operation. Then I say set the layout as a new border layout. And then I say I've got J button, button 1, button 2, button 3, button 4. That says north, south, east, west, center. And then I add button 1, border layout dot north, so it knows where to put that button. Where to put button 2, where to put button 3, where to put button 4 and 5. So north, south, east, west. Set visible true, and then there's our public static void main to execute the whole thing. So I run this guy, and look at that. The button takes up the entire region. So the north button takes up the entire north, the west takes up all the way west, so on and so forth. So each one of these guys has a button filling the whole thing. But we can change that. We have another called a panel. Okay, so we can actually add the panel into this guy, and let's see what that looks like. So if I take a look at the border panel, there again, border panel window extends JFrame. Here is my border panel window, which is my constructor, and executes the set title, set default close operation, set layout as a new border layout. Except this time I'm creating a panel. I create 5 separate panels. Panel 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then I create my 5 buttons. That looks no different. The only difference now is panel 1 dot add button 1, panel 2 dot add button 2, so on and so forth. Then I come down here, instead of adding the button to that border layout north, south, east, west, center, I add the panel. Now the button will be the standard button size. We're just adding the panel to each one of those sections. And then I say pack. Pack basically packs it all together, and then set visible equals true. So whenever we basically put panels inside of borders, we have to pack it before we do anything else. Let me go back in the book where it basically talks about pack. Yeah. So anyway, so if I run this guy, notice there's all 5 buttons and all 5 different zones. Again, there's no code there, so if I click on them, nothing happens. But again, the buttons are all the standard button size, and they're inside of a panel that's now inside of a border layout. Next thing we have is what's called a grid manager. We have a grid layout, which allows us to basically set up a grid. So if we take a look at the grid window, we've got a width of 400, height of 200. We've got a set title, set size, default close. We got set layout, new grid 2, 3. That's basically, I believe, 2 columns, 3 rows. And there I have button 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 6. And then I add those buttons to the current pane, to the content pane. And it will automatically put each button 1 goes in the first, column 1, row 1, column 1. Next one goes in row 1, column 2, row 2, column 1, row 2, column 2, so on and so forth. And then we say set visible true. Run this guy, here's what happens. It fills up each button. I'm sorry, we got 2 rows. 2 rows, 3 columns. It basically has each button fill up that section. Again, if we don't want that to happen, we have to add panels. So if I come back over here to my grid panels, same thing, I got set layout, new grid layout 2, 3. I create my 6 buttons. This time I create 6 labels. I also create 6 panels, and then I add the panels, add the labels to the panels, and I add the buttons to the panels, and then I add the panels to the grid. Set visible equals true, run it, and there I have my labels and buttons in each grid. Okay, we'll cover radio buttons and check boxes, and we'll call it a night. So radio buttons, again, we talked about those earlier. When you click one and if you click another one, it automatically turns the other one off. But they have to be in the same group. So if I have two different groups of radio buttons, I can group them. They will basically only interact with each other within that group. So let's just take a look at the code. I got a button group class, a JRadio button class. Metric converter. Let's take a look at metric converter. So here I've got my J panel, my J label, J text field, J radio button, miles button, J radio button, feet button, J radio button, inches button. Then I've got my button group. Again, we always want to group. We always have to group our radio buttons. If we don't, if I just have radio buttons on my panel, it considers them all grouped together. So if I have sex and maybe age groups, it won't let you basically interact. You have to put them in separate groups. So I call this the button. So it's basically a data type called button group, and we're calling it radio button group. You probably want to call it whatever, a sex radio button group. So here's my metric converter. So this is my constructor, since it's got the same name as my class. I do my set title, set size, set default close. I've got a build panel in here. So I come down here to build panel. This is where I basically create my, instantiate my label, my text field, my buttons, and then I basically create my radio groups. I got my radio button group equals new button group, so I instantiate that. And then I create a radio button group dot add miles button. So I add the miles button to the button group, radio button group, the feet button to the radio button group, and the inches button to the radio button group. Then I say miles button dot add action listener, feet button add action listener, and inches add action. So I create 3 separate listeners for each radio button, because depending on what radio button you click on, we only want that code for that button to execute. I instantiate a new panel. Then I add the message label to the panel, the kilo text field to the panel, the miles button to the panel, the feet button to the button panel, and the inches button to the panel. Now realize the those guys are, again, we don't have to add the group, we just have to add the buttons. So miles button, feet button, inch button. Then I've got my, here's my radio button listener for the entire group. Here's my action performed, so I'm capturing which item got clicked on. I got my string input, got my string convert to, I've got my double result. I initialize it to 0.0. I say input.kilo text field get text. If the e.source is miles button, I do the conversion for miles. If the e.source dot is the feet button, then I do the feet conversion. If the e-source is inches, then I basically do the inches, and then I basically display that the input kilometers is, boom, convert to. Now what is convert to? Well, that's a field that we have up here called convert to. We've got feet, inches, and miles, so we'll know what they are converted to, and then we display that. Here's my public static void main, so it executes that guy. Click on it. Here's what I get. Type in 100, convert to miles, displays 100 kilometers is 62.1399999 miles. I can then click on the next radio button, convert to feet. 100 kilometers is, well gosh, what is that? 3,281,000, no, 328,100 feet. Inches, that is 3,937,000 inches. Okay. Now here's something I want you to kind of be aware of as well. This is where we'd have to kind of bring chapter 11 into, we're going to capture exceptions. But if I run this guy and I click on the radio button without putting anything in there, notice I get red text down below. So it's basically, I get basically a null, what's number format exception. So I could actually capture, I could actually put an exception, create an exception, try catch exception for a number format exception. In this case, I would display, hey, you need to enter a number in that box before running it. Okay, the very last thing is our checkboxes and color checkbox window. So here we have the color checkbox window. And so here I've got my label. I've got a checkbox called yellow checkbox, a checkbox called red checkbox. I've got my window height 300, and our width is 300, height is 100. My constructor, color checkbox window. Again, it's a no art constructor. Again, I set my title, I set my size, I set my default close operation, and then I say message label. Select the check boxes to change the colors. And I got yellow checkbox equals new, so this is where I instantiate it. And it's got yellow background is the name of the checkbox, and red foreground is the name of the other checkbox. I say yellow checkbox to add listener. So I create a listener for the yellow checkbox, and I create a listener for the red checkbox. It's listening. When you click on it, it goes I execute. I set the layout as a new flow layout. I go ahead and add the message label and the yellow checkbox and the red checkbox to the window. Notice I'm not using any panels. I set visible equals true. When the whenever we select a checkbox, the checkbox listener automatically executes. This is where you get the E dot, because again we got the item event E. So now here we got something different here. We got the item event listener. Let's take a look at that in the book. So when a checkbox object is selected or deselected, it generates an item event. Okay, this is an item event. You handle items events in the same way you do as an action. First, you must write an item listener class, not an action listener class, an item listener class. And so basically, it basically gets handled the same exact way, except it's not an action, it's an item. So in this case, we capture the item itself, which is whatever button we clicked. And if it's a yellow checkbox, we do whatever we need to do for the yellow checkbox. And if it's a red checkbox, we basically do whatever it is for the red checkbox. Okay? Now, but here's what's different about checkboxes. They're either checked or they're unchecked. So in this case, we say if it's a yellow checkbox, if the checkbox is selected, that means if there is a check in the checkbox, we're going to do this. We're going to set the background color to yellow. We're going to set the red checkbox background to yellow.
Don't do it, it hurts your eyeballs.
No. Else, if the box is unchecked, we're going to set everything to light gray. Same thing with the red checkbox. If the red checkbox is selected and it's got a check mark, we're going to set the foreground color and we're going to set all those things to red. Else, we're going to set them all to black. So we run this. Here it is. If I check the yellow checkbox, everything turns yellow. Uncheck it, turns to light gray. Check the red, foreground color gets set to red. Uncheck it, gets set back to black. So if I can check the red and the yellow, it turns on. I can uncheck the red, I can uncheck the yellow. So again, it's an item, so we have to capture the item and basically then do whatever that we have to say. Is it selected? Is it checked? Is it isn't checked? And do whatever needs to happen at that point. Normally, checkboxes don't always work this way, where we have to basically kind of have a listener. We can actually just check a box and then just check to see if that box is selected and do something. I might have a button down here where it says, you know, change background color or change color. So it doesn't actually do the color changing until I click the button. So I wouldn't need an action listener at that point, or an item listener. Okay, that is all we are going to cover tonight. We will continue on next week with borders. Again, any questions, make sure you basically give me a yell, and I'll be glad to answer any questions you might have. I will change the home before we leave.